Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Dr. Nick Morgan in Boston, Massachusetts. Nick is one of America's top communications theorists and coaches. He's a former fellow at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He founded Public Words, Inc., a consulting firm specializing in communications, in 1997. Nick has been commissioned by Fortune 50 companies to write for many CEOs and presidents. He has coached people to give congressional testimony, to appear on the Today Show, and to deliver an unforgettable TED Talk. He's also the author of multiple books, including Power Cues, The Subtle Science of Leading Groups, Persuading Others, and Maximizing Your Personal Impact. Nick, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you, Angela.
Well, I mentioned before we got started that I recently heard you speaking on Anderson Cooper 360. I actually got a chance to hear you twice, where you critiqued the body language of the presidential candidates after the Republican debate. And it was so interesting. I'm just so enthralled. Can you talk to us a little bit about body language, why body language is important, and why should we care?
Sure. So every communication is two conversations. And while most of my comments apply to face-to-face conversations where you're in the same room with the other person, they still also apply over the phone and the way we conduct a lot of business these days in webinars and virtual meetings and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Just a little less information gets through. But every communication is two conversations. Mm-hmm. It's the content on the one hand. It's what we all spend a lot of time thinking about it, what you're saying. And then it's the body language. And the funny thing is that when the body language and the content conflict, mm-hmm. people always believe your body language. This is something that people say to themselves, oh, yeah, sure, of course, I kind of knew that, but they never think about it in quite that way. Mm-hmm. And to give a very simple example, let's say on my way home from work today, I chat with my spouse, and she tells me to pick up milk and eggs on the way home, and let's say I forget, because I'm a rotten husband, and when I walk in the door, she sees me, realizes I don't have the milk and eggs, and I suddenly remember too, and I say, oh, how are you, hon? And she crosses her arms and scowls. She would never do this. My real spouse would never do this, let me hasten to say. But let's say pretend spouse crosses her arms and scowls and says, I'm fine, because that's what grown-ups say. Now that makes it so simple. Everybody gets it right away. The content is the words, I'm fine. And the body language says otherwise. Mm-hmm. Which do you believe? Well, that makes it easy, doesn't it? Of course you believe the body language. And so that's why it's important to study body language, because whenever there's that kind of conflict going on, then we always believe the body language. And if you don't think about your body language, then you leave it to chance. Mm-hmm. Then you leave it to whatever's going on in the moment. And your listeners are interested in things like job interviews. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the classic places where it is important to think about your body language, because typically what's the situation when you walk into a job interview? You're nervous, right?
Right.
So what you don't want is your nervousness about the job interview to overwhelm, to cancel out your enthusiasm for the job, which you try to express in the content. Gee, Mr. Smith, I'd really like to work for you. Mm-hmm. But if your body language is saying, gee, Mr. Smith, I'm really frightened, then the message that Mr. Smith gets is that you're frightened, not that you'd really like to work for him. So that's, again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically the reason why you should think about body language.
Yes, absolutely. So in particular with a job interview, how quickly do people sort of make a judgment about us? How long do we have to make that sort of first impression with that body language?
It's astounding how fast. There are various estimates of it, but if you think in terms of about 30 seconds, you're not far wrong. It's actually faster than that, but I don't want to frighten your listeners. And the reason is that we're making those judgments not with our conscious minds, but with our unconscious minds. And the unconscious mind picks up the vibrations, the impression, the sense of what the other person intends in a matter of milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is when we walk into a job interview situation, both of us are sizing each other up, the interviewer and the interviewee, and we're saying, first of all, friend or foe. That's what our unconscious mind is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Is this person somebody that we can like or somebody that we should be suspicious of?
Yes.
And of course, obviously, you want to begin to establish that initial trust. You want to have a favorable impression. And so, once again, to put it very simply, if your body language is nervous because you're shy or frightened or an introvert or you're scared or the stakes are high for the job or any one of many reasons,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to convey the impression that you're not a friend, you're rather a foe. And that's not the right impression. So you want to think about opening up your body language and walking in with confidence and warmth and a smile on your face before you even start to talk, because the unconscious mind picks up those impressions, as I say, in a matter of milliseconds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, you can work over time to overcome that initial impression, but it's hard work. It's like starting out with a couple of strikes against you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when it comes to sort of that initial impression, what percentage of it is the body language and what percent is what comes out of your mouth? I mean, just roughly, I would assume it's more heavily weighted on the body language side.
Well, in terms of that initial impression, it's about 1/3 is your tone of voice.
Okay.
Not what you say, but your tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
2/3 are the visual impression you're making. That's from your face to your gestures to the way you're standing to even what you're wearing.
Mm-hmm.
And about approximately 0 is what you're saying.
Oh,
in terms of the impression that you're making. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now let me hasten to say that don't misunderstand this.
Mm-hmm.
If you walk in with lots of enthusiasm and you've got a big smile on your face and you're open and friendly and engaging, then that body language will support your content, which is presumably about what great things you and the company can do together and how enthusiastic you are about the job. Then the interviewer will be able to hear that content.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm talking about is when your body language undercuts your content, then 0 of that content is going to get through, because what the other person is going to be seeing and hearing is the body language.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's an important caveat. The whole idea is to think about body language so that you can align it with your content, so that you can make it support your content, not undercut it. It's when you undercut it that the problems start and that people always believe the body language. Think back to my example of the spouse and her saying the words "I'm fine." That's content that says she's fine. But if I believe that, I'd be the stupidest husband ever.
That's true. That's true. You know, I really find it interesting that you mentioned the tone of voice. I've worked with a lot of clients where I've actually spoken to them about, be less worried about saying everything exactly perfectly and think more about sort of overall the energy that you're kind of giving off. Because you may say something, you may stumble on something, but they're going to remember how they felt around you, I think, more than exactly what you said.
Yes, that's
that
correct.
Makes sense.
That's correct. So the tone of voice is, as I say, it's about 1/3 of our impression. So it's important to think about it. It's important not to be too quiet in your tone of voice or not to strangle your voice because you're nervous.
Right.
A lot of people, when they get nervous, their throats and their mouths and faces tend to get tense. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the sound doesn't come out of there. It sounds strangled. It's, hello, nice to meet you. And it's not as effective as if you're confident.
That's a really good point. So when you first meet someone for a job interview, one of the first things that happens as you meet them is actually that you get a chance to shake their hand. Do you kind of consider that as part of the whole body language equation?
Sure. And lots of ink has been spilt and words have been said about how important the handshake is. And our original understanding was that the reason for the handshake went back to ancient times when we shook hands with each other to show that we weren't concealing any weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that, along with everybody else who writes about body language for a long time. There's been some recent research that suggests that the actual reason we shake hands is because we pick up each other's scents a little bit that way, the smell of the other person, and it's completely unconscious. And in fact, there's some, as part of that research, the researchers videotape people shaking hands, and an astonishing number of people, after they shake hands, sniff their fingers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's something that's just fun to watch. The next time you go to a cocktail party and see a lot of people shaking hands, count the number of people who sniff their fingers afterwards, completely unconsciously. They're not aware of it. If you ask them, they'll say they didn't do it. But watch for that, because if that research is correct, then the real reason we shake hands is to pick up each other's scent, much like animals that sniff each other when they meet.
Wow, I'm going to be looking for that tonight.
It's a good party game to play while you're standing around at a cocktail party.
I could see that. Well, you have a book, Power Cues, where you talk about knowing your own power cues. Can you talk a little bit about, what are the cues within ourselves that we should be more aware of, especially when we're going out and interviewing for a job?
Absolutely. The first thing I suggest, the first power cue, is to take stock of yourself and to think about how it is that you show up. And by that I mean, when you walk into a room, what's your habitual stance, your attitude, your posture, all the little things that add up to the general impression that other people get of you. And most of the time we don't think about that. We're looking at the other people. We're watching out so that we don't bump into the furniture. We're not thinking about ourselves. So it's a good thing to start with, to take stock of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you a quick story that illustrates why it's important. I was working with an executive who called me up because he said he had just been promoted to senior vice president of a big company, utility company, in fact. And this was the culmination of a 25-year climb up the executive ladder, and he was very thrilled to have the job. It was his life's ambition to be an SVP at this company, so he was happy.
Mm-hmm.
But they were about to fire him, and the reason was he'd been promoted through the ranks because he was good in a crisis. He was considered cool in a crisis, and that's, of course, a good thing, especially at a utility company, one can imagine.
Right.
Well, once he got to the SVP level, he had to do different things. He had to motivate employees. He had to be a spokesperson for the company.
Mm-hmm.
And this coolness that he'd cultivated over all these years was suddenly a huge handicap for him because he was getting evaluations and feedback from the people that reported to him and to his colleagues to say he was cold.
Mm-hmm.
He came across as uncaring. And an SVP of a public company can appear to be uncaring. So he called me up and said, is there anything you can do about this? So I said, sure. And we got together and we met in one of those conference rooms with a long brown conference table.
Mm-hmm.
And he did something very strange right from the beginning. He sat down at the corner of the table. Now, most executives, when I work with them, they'll sit in the center because they know that's where the power is, and either they've been taught that or they instinctively feel that.
Mm-hmm.
So they sit in the center of the table. He went and sat in the corner with his eyes downcast and his shoulders rounded. I actually had to move my stuff, go sit down at the end of the table in order that I could talk to him.
Oh, wow.
And so we're chatting away, and I'm just observing this body language. And after a while, I call him on it, and I say, isn't this odd? You tell me that you are pleased to be the SVP of a publicly traded company. That's a public role. You must expect that you have to go out and meet with shareholders, stakeholders, and the public and your employees. And yet all your body language suggests you wish to remain quiet, invisible in the corner.
Mm-hmm.
What's up with that? Why are you doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And to my astonishment, he started crying.
Oh, no.
And he said, I haven't thought about this for years, but I was bullied from age 12 to age 18.
Okay.
And I didn't think of it this way, but I guess I learned to be invisible.
Oh, no.
And what he didn't realize was all those years later, he was in his 50s, he was still carrying around that body language memory, that muscle memory of trying to be invisible, trying to escape the bullying.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about body language, it's good, first of all, as a first step, a first power cue, to notice what is our body language saying, not only about how we're feeling right in the moment, but about our history. We tend to carry our history around with us in our body language. And so if you are a confident person who's always done well in sports and done well in school, you carry yourself in one way. If you've been bullied for 6 years or 4 years, you might carry yourself in another way. And so the first step is to start to pay attention to yourself. Just notice without judgment how it is that you tend to sit. Do you slouch? Do you sit up straight? Are you confident? Are you shy and retiring? How do you stand? When you walk into a room, do you walk in with a lot of energy, or do you kind of creep into the room like my client did and sit down in the corner? So all these things add up to the kinds of impressions that other people get of you and the impressions they form of you. And so if you don't take stock of them, then you're just leaving it to whatever is the chance, however you're showing up now.
Right, absolutely. Gosh. So as we become more aware of those nonverbal communications that we're putting out there, I mean, how can we focus on changing it, and where should we be focusing that energy?
So there are a couple of ways you can think about it. You can either focus specifically on the body language,
Okay.
or you can focus on the underlying emotion and let the body language take care of itself. And by saying it that way, I don't mean to imply that one is easy and the other is hard. They're both difficult because we're talking about either emotions or unconscious behavior. And so it's work in both cases to become aware of it and to manage it or control it. But you can start to notice your body language. So when you meet somebody, do you open up your hands and keep them away from your body so that your gesture is opening and welcoming, or do you close off? Do you fold your hands nervously in front of your stomach, clasp them together, and thereby indicate that you're being defensive? So you can think about when you're meeting people or going on job interviews, is my body language open or closed? And it's important that it be closed. So if you notice that it's important that it be open. If you notice that it's closed, then you want to start opening it up, and you can think about that consciously. Normally, people don't think about their body language consciously, so this is work. That's what I mean by that.
Right.
The other way to approach it is to spend some time working on your emotions. So before you go into that meeting, when you're sitting in the car on the way to the meeting, say, or if you're waiting in a waiting room, or if you're checking yourself in the bathroom before you go to the meeting, right? Then you can, with a little work and a little practice, you can learn how to focus your emotion and create some enthusiasm, to imagine yourself being enthusiastic, or perhaps to remember a time when you were naturally enthusiastic. Put yourself back into that moment so that you can work up some enthusiasm. So then if you walk in with lots of enthusiasm, and it's genuinely created enthusiasm that you've learned how to create for real inside yourself on command, then your body language will convey that enthusiasm. So it's your choice. You can do it either way. We say it's working from the outside in or the inside out. Either way works, but you need to, it's good to pick one which is best for you and work on it.
That's interesting. So I recently read something about like this power pose where you put your hands on your hips for so many minutes, and that it's supposed to kind of subconsciously help you before you go in. Have you heard of that, and do you subscribe to that, or I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
Sure, that's my good friend Amy Cuddy's work. Here in Boston, she's at Harvard, and unfortunately, subsequent research did not bear that out.
Okay.
There are too many caveats. The best way to say it is, it might help you a little, especially if you're already confident, but it doesn't seem to really change your feeling. So if you're nervous, putting your hands on your hips in the bathroom for a few minutes beforehand isn't going to do a lot to really change your mood. And the reason is that you need to work on that mental activity at the same time. And so if I always say to people when they ask me about Cuddy's research, I say, well, you can stand there with your hands on your hips, but what if your brain is saying to you, you look like an idiot? And for most of us who have gotten nervous before, say, an important speech or a job interview, we know what's going on. The brain says, oh, no, I'm nervous. Something could go wrong. What if the person doesn't like me? What if the speech goes badly? What if I forget what I'm supposed to say? What if the technology fails? What if, and your brain starts role-playing these disasters.
Mm-hmm.
That then feeds your body and increases your nervousness. And then what happens is your brain notices your increased nervousness, and it starts role-playing even more disasters. And so it's a vicious circle. The problem with just standing there with your hands on your hips is you haven't stopped the circle. You've just attacked one piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really need to attack both pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you need to become aware of your body, and yes, you need to teach your body to stand confidently, but also you need to work on what the fear is behind that. So what is it specifically for you? Is it the fear of meeting some person for the first time? Is it a fear of speaking in public? And then figure out what's the source of that fear and work on that. And then you can take care of the negative consequences and show up as your best self.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so in a number of the talks that you've done, you've also talked about the importance of being authentic. So we're kind of going through this process, right? We're in a job interview, we're nervous, we're trying to pay attention to our body language. Beyond all of that, how can we work on, increasing our authenticity when we talk to people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and people often say, well, isn't managing your emotions, doesn't that make you sort of inauthentic? And it's funny, we never ask Hollywood actors when they're playing a scene, unless they're playing it badly, we never say, are they inauthentic? We say, boy, how authentic they are when the emotion is strong and they seem to be really committed to the scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when your emotion is strong and you're committed to the scene, then you look like, and it feels to you like you're fully present.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels authentic. And so what really I'm about is coaching people to figure out what's my best self. What is it I want to achieve? Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up? And I want to show up as my best self on my best day, not as somebody who's kind of half there and having a crappy day and got a to-do list in my head, so I'm not really paying attention to what's going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
And so the kinds of techniques I'm talking about where you focus on your body language or you focus on your emotion, that's really a way of helping you show up as your best self, so your most authentic self, the person you want to be on a best day rather than kind of lousy day, it's rainy outside and I'm not feeling great and having a kind of a half so crappy day.
Right.
Right? Why would you want to show up as that?
Right, exactly.
Especially for a job interview or a big speech or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. So you mentioned something I was wanting to ask you about, which is for those of us who may be struggling in particular with this issue, you actually are available, it sounds like, to do coaching with those people to help them. And you mentioned it also with the executive example earlier. It sounds like you work directly with clients to help them move through this issue. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we work in a couple of ways.
Uh-huh.
We do one-time interventions, if you will, day-long or two-day crash courses. And then the person goes out and tries everything and see how it goes. Or we also work longer term with people who want to change their behavior more slowly over time. That's more typically the way we work with highly placed executives because they're very busy, and so they only get, I'll get an hour of their time every couple of weeks, and we'll talk about how's it going and give them some techniques to work on and then check back in. So we work both ways, but yeah, that's an important part of what we do is helping people get out of their own way, really, become their best selves.
Yeah, I love that. So another part that's really important, right, during a job interview is that you're able to establish not just authenticity, but credibility, especially when you're meeting new people who you've never met before. What suggestions do you have for us in terms of how can we create that credibility when we're speaking to someone new?
Well, I'll give you an easy one and a hard one. So,
okay.
The easy one is not to talk like this. An awful lot of people do it, where at the end of every sentence, their voice goes up as if they were asking a question, This is the fastest way to undercut your credibility? You don't sound like you know what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And how many people do you know who talk like this?
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds. I meet them all the time. And I always show them, if I'm working with a client, I'll show them the example of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Okay.
And I'll say to them, if Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, would anybody have remembered that speech? And the answer is obviously no.
No.
But he didn't. He said, I have a dream. He dropped his voice at the end of the phrase, and as a result, it sounded strong and authoritative, and people believed him. So that's the easy one, is watch your tone of voice, because if it goes up all the time, that's a disease of modern life. A lot of people talk like that. It's a kind of a collegial way of getting agreement. And if you have one of those companies or organizations that you work in where it's very important to build consensus and agreement, you may find yourself doing this all the time, always speaking like this with your voice going up. That doesn't come across as credible.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to do the opposite. So that's the easy one. Just make sure your voice comes down, not like a question where it goes up, but down like you mean it.
Mm-hmm.
Or like your mother or father said, Nicholas, it's time to go to bed. They didn't say, when I was 8, Nicholas, it's time to go to bed, because I would have heard that as a question. I would have said, no, it's not.
Right.
So that's how you handle it in the easy way. The more difficult way is, or the real work, where there's real work involved, is to think about what are the problems that this company has or this organization has that I'm interviewing for that I have some real solutions for.
Mm-hmm.
And start to suggest those solutions. Because think about it like going to a doctor's office. We find the doctor credible when we present our symptoms to the doctor and the doctor says, well, here's what you've got and here's how you might cure the problem, right? So.
Absolutely. So, Nick, another issue that really comes up a lot with people who are interviewing for jobs is they will come in and say, I don't know how it went. It could have gone well. It could have gone poorly. I'm really just not sure what to think about it. And I think that's where some tips, I'd love it if you could share tips on how can we read the other person? How can we read that person who's interviewing us, that hiring manager, to know whether or not it is going well?
Well, I'll tell you my favorite story about that, and then your audience will be able to pick up a couple of tips.
Mm-hmm.
This was back in the mid-'90s. I was working for a large consulting company before I started my own company, Public Words. Mm-hmm. And I got laid off. The company had expanded really quickly. I'd been hired in a fit of enthusiasm, and then the company had suddenly experienced dropping revenue. So they laid me off. Mm-hmm. Well, I had a mortgage and 2 young children, and I really needed the job. So when I walked out the door with my cardboard box of possessions, I was feeling pretty down. But it was my lucky day also, because the phone rang as I walked in the door at home. And it was another consulting company. It's a small world, the consulting world, and they had already heard that there were layoffs and that I might be available. So they said, Nick, would you come up to Boston for a job interview? Mm-hmm. I said, sure, absolutely. And I remember I really wanted this job. So we were going to meet in a restaurant up here in the Boston area. It's Legal Seafoods, which is a great little chain. This is a plug for Legal Seafoods, if you like seafood. Yeah, great little chain of mid-price restaurants. Mm-hmm. Nice, but not really top end, but always good quality. All right, so I arranged to meet there, and the interviewer doesn't allow me to order off the menu. I think he's trying to show off or something. And he says, just bring Mr. Morgan the biggest lobster we've got.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking, this must be a test to see whether I can eat lobster without spilling it on my brand new tie, which I'd worn for the interview. And I'm thinking, I can do that. I grew up in New England. So I started eating the lobster. What I didn't know was I'd been away from New England for a long time, hadn't tried any lobster for a number of years. I'd grown allergic to lobster in the meanwhile.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so my throat starts closing. I start choking. Remember, I really wanted this job. So I say, excuse me, and rush off to the bathroom, stick 2 fingers down my throat. I throw up. I come back out, and I continue the interview. Mm-hmm. Now, any sane person would have just said, "Excuse me, I'm allergic to lobster. Can we do this without the lobster, or can we do this another time?" But remember, I wanted the job. I wasn't completely sane at that point. I really wanted that job, and so I didn't think I had permission somehow to state the obvious. So I was just pushing the lobster around on my plate. And sure enough, soon the interviewer noticed, and he said, "Is there something wrong with the lobster?" "Oh, no," I said, "it's fine." And I took a couple of bites. Well, my throat started closing up again, and I started to choke, so I said, "Excuse me," went off to the bathroom, threw up again, came back out, continued the interview. Now, this interviewer was so intent on selling me on the company that he actually didn't notice that I was allergic. He was just concerned that I wasn't eating the lobster. So it happened a third time. At that point, I'm so angry at the whole thing that I decided I'm going to use one of my Jedi body language mind tricks on this guy to make sure I get the job. And this is what you do. So you start mirroring the person sitting opposite. Now, that doesn't mean literally copying every single tiny little gesture, but sitting in roughly the same position they're sitting and doing the kind of big gestures that they do. So the guy puts down his knife and fork after a split-second delay. You might slowly put down your knife and fork, too. And then if he brings his hand up on the table, you might do the same thing. So you mirror the behavior. And I mirrored his behavior for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then I led him. I gave him a couple of body language suggestions. And what he did was he mirrored them back exactly. And so at that point, I knew I had gotten the job. Because think about what a job interview is. I'm helping the interviewer if I connect with him or her and they feel like, oh, I can trust this person. Because really what if it gets as far as a job interview, right, you want to offer the person the job if possible, because it saves you some time and energy, right? You're done.
Yeah.
You've found the right person. So the question the interviewer is asking himself or herself is, do I get along with this person? Is this person trustworthy? Do I like this person? Are they like me? Are we comfortable together? Is this a good fit? That kind of thing. And weirdly, one of the ways to answer that question is, does this person mirror my behavior? Because if you watch two people in love, or two close friends who've known each other for many years, or two colleagues who've worked together for a long time and trust each other, you'll notice that they tend to mirror each other's behavior. It's our body language way of saying, I agree with you, I am like you, I'm simpatico with you. And so if you're very clever about it, you can do it artificially, as I did there in a job interview. You have to be subtle enough that you're not sort of obviously jerking around to mirror the person's behavior. You have to make it part of your flow and do it elegantly and subtly. But if you do that, then the message you're sending to the other person is exactly that. Yes, I am like you. You can trust me. We're comfortable together because we're like a pair of old friends.
I like that a lot.
And then once you've done that, once you've established that connection, as I say, it takes a good 15, 20 minutes. You need to give it some time because we're dealing with the unconscious mind here, and it takes a while. Then you can lead and make suggestions, and then what you find is that makes the connection even stronger. And if the person responds and follows you, then you've got them. You've got the job.
Wow, that's such a great suggestion. I love it. I definitely want to try this very soon.
Yeah, do try this at home.
Right. So now, once we have the job, I'd like to ask you a question, kind of back to your example about the executive. And you were talking about the position that he was seated at the conference table. So we've gotten a job. We work in a big corporation. Can you just briefly talk kind of high level about the different seats at the conference table and what they mean in relation to some of the other seats?
Yeah, sure. So the power seats are, and there's a lot of misinformation about this, so some people think it's the end of the table. I'm assuming a sort of a long rectangular-shaped conference table.
Right.
But the power seats are in the middle. That's because you can control the seating on either side, and you're sort of closest. Everybody's closest to you that way. Because power and proximity are connected. So the closer you are to somebody, the closer you are to the power. But the power is in the center. And it's the most powerful position is the one with your back to the wall and your face to the door in the center. And so everything that kind of diminishes goes down from there out. The least powerful positions are the ones that you sometimes see in big meetings where some people are privileged to sit right around the table and other people sit against the wall. Right? Those are you might as well be in Siberia in terms of the power there. You're hardly even allowed to speak if you're sitting in one of those seats.
That's right. That's right. And what about, like, if there's someone who you're sitting next to them, maybe on the same side of the table? Is there some kind of meaning around that as well?
Well, so typically what will happen is if it's a team where the power has already been sorted out, there's somebody who's in charge, the boss perhaps, and then other people, you'll see that the boss will go and sit in that center power position. The next most powerful person will sit at the right hand of the boss. The third most powerful person will sit at the left hand of the boss. And so on down the list until you're out in the outer darkness somewhere there at the end of the table.
Yes.
And the stronger positions are on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. It's not good to put too much emphasis on this because, of course, with a team where everybody's used to everybody else and somebody is running late, they might intend to sit one place and end up sitting another just because that place is taken. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but that's typically, if other things aside, if there aren't other reasons why people sit where they're sitting, then that's how it lands.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I spent most of my career in corporate at very large corporations, and I find this just to be fascinating. And like you said, you don't put too much emphasis, but once you're aware of it, it is kind of interesting to sort of observe what's happening.
Yeah, I was working with a woman, an executive who happened to be very small in height, and she had an issue with some of the men who were physically big in her organization, dominating the room, interrupting her a lot, sort of not giving her enough respect. And when we talked about where she was sitting in the meetings, it turned out that she always sat in the corner. And so I said, okay, what I want you to do is get there early enough that you can grab one of the center seats. It doesn't have to be the most powerful seat, but close to it. And see what difference it makes. And that little change made a huge difference in terms of how much they interrupted her. It's fascinating.
No, it's very interesting.
So seating is important.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered many different topics today. I really appreciate it. I know this is going to be great information for our listeners. Is there any other advice that you'd like to leave us with today?
Yes. One of the little exercises I do with audiences when I'm speaking to them in person is I do a little posture exercise. And it turns out that there are two aspects of modern life that really have bad effects on our posture. The first is mobile phones. And when you're walking around holding a mobile phone, think about what that does to your posture. It pulls your head forward, right, because you're looking down. Now, the quick version, normally I do this, as I say, as an experiment with the group, but on this podcast, and because we're running out of time, the quick version is that when you walk into a room with your head down because you're looking at a phone, the effect you convey to other people is that you're unhappy to be there, you're submissive, you're not important, you're depressed, all kinds of negative things, nothing positive. And so the first body language tip that's really important is before you walk into that meeting, put away the cell phone, hold your head up high. The second one is specifically for women, is if you're going to an important meeting or a job interview, and one of the things you do when you dress up for that is you put on high heels. Be very aware, the whole purpose of high heels is to give you that sexy walk down the runway like a model. Right? So the point of high heels is it lifts up your heels. It means you're standing essentially on tiptoes. That can push your pelvis forward. And so that gives you this flirtatious walk. If you want to be taken seriously in an organization, then you have to make sure you're not walking like that model down the runway. Flirtation will only get you so far. It won't get you taken seriously.
Absolutely. Well, that's great advice. So for our listeners who are interested to get in touch with you, where can they learn more about you and your business?
A run, don't walk to our website, publicwords.com, PUBLICWORDS.com, and all the information is there.
Great. And are you on social media?
Absolutely. It's at Dr. Nick Morgan on Twitter, and we're on Facebook, so you can find the Public Words site, the Dr. Nick Morgan site also on Facebook.
Great. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining me. This is one of my favorite topics. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to ensure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.